Hi everyone, today we are going to start our modern issues unit, and we're going to be talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict. You've already done some history on that in our history unit with the Mandate period, so we're going to do a quick review on that and then focus more on the modern issues, even though it has been a continuous issue since the Mandate period. So let's start with why there's an argument. And the argument is over who does the land belong to, and who has the correct claim. So the land itself, as referenced, is the land of Canaan, also known as Eretz Yisrael, which is where you get the term Israel from, as in the land of Israel. And the idea was it was promised by God to the children of Israel. And that term is mentioned in both the Hebrew Bible and the Quran. So the conflict actually comes over who is defined as the children of Israel. So in the Jewish belief, it's believed that this promise was given to Abraham, the first prophet. So they believe it actually should be those who descended from his grandson Jacob, and those are the people of Jewish descent. The Muslim belief is that the promise happened, but it should be running through those who descended from Abraham's eldest son, Ishmael, and that is the Muslim descendants. So the conflict is over this area. It's not just about Israel in itself, although that's where it's all focused today. It's really considered the Levant, is that that historical region in the Middle East that dates back to the biblical times, and all of the monotheistic Abrahamic religions identify that. That's what the picture is of on the slide, where it is heavily focused and where at different times it had been spread out to be considered. Yeah. All right, so you have that argument happening, and then you also have ethnic movements that occur. So we talked about Zionism, that comes up during the Mandate period, and it's this belief that there is a Jewish homeland, and they should all return there for their own freedom and safety on their part. And it's usually supported by different countries that want to have their minority population leave and go somewhere else. It becomes very popular just before the start of World War II, as many Jewish communities were suffering through either exile or displacement, leading up to the Holocaust, and then afterwards, those that were trying to survive in many areas where displacement had occurred and they weren't welcomed back. So that's one ethnic movement. Another would be Arab nationalism. So this is happening really prior to the Mandate period, because the people who controlled Palestine prior to the Mandate period, so prior to Britain taking over, was the Ottoman Empire. And while the Ottoman Empire used to be very large, by the time World War I comes around, it had shrunk quite a bit. And the heart of the Ottoman Empire was Turkey. And what had been happening for many years is the Ottoman Empire really pushing the ethnic supremacy of the Turks, and treating the Arab population very similar to how many places in Europe were treating the Jewish population as second-class citizens and lesser than them. So you see this rise in Arab nationalism, where they are tired of being put down in their own homeland and really joining together to argue for more freedom and a place of their own. Okay. So Then the Mandate period occurs, which, remember, you have British rule. So they come in and they take over everything, and they're using their army to enforce, and they're setting up borders that they want. Has nothing to do with the people there. You have the White Paper of 1939, which limits Jewish immigration. You have the SS Exodus, which is the Holocaust refugee ship that was stopped by the British from bringing in refugees into Israel. And then you have basically this end plan. So Britain wants to be done with controlling the Middle East. They don't find anything of, it's not worth the trouble that they have trying to maintain a conflict, which they started in terms of really pitting the groups against each other and constantly working against peace. So on May 15th, 1947, you have the approval of a plan put forth by UNSCOP. So that's the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. So they make this special committee to deal with the issue of Palestine. And they come up with two plans, a majority plan and minority plan. So what is our big picture, and then what do we think should also happen? So the majority plan was a plan of partition with economic union, meaning how do we divide Palestine to give people their own areas, but also to keep them together as sort of a trade system, which is why you don't see the state of Palestine and the state of Israel being suggested. You see different partitions and saying this is Palestinian area and this is Israeli area, but just one state, because they wanted that economy to stay together. And then there's also a minority plan, which went against that and said you need to create an independent state of Palestine. If you're going to make a state of Israel, you need to make a state of Palestine, and both of those should be recognized. In case you haven't figured it out, when the plan passes, only the majority plan passes. So they basically focus on how are they going to make money and maintain economic ties. And I'm talking about the UN, Europe, figuring this out. And they really kind of leave the social concept to the wayside. Okay, so that all comes down, and right away you have conflict happening. People are very upset about it. So that's, again, May 15th, 1947. So let's talk about the Arab-Israeli War, which will respond to that, essentially. So a year later, okay, so the whole plan was put into place with the agreement that at the end of the year, everything should be running smoothly enough for Britain to no longer be involved. So May 14th, 1948, a year minus a day, the British mandate expires, so Britain no longer has to be involved. And the state of Israel is declared, meaning they officially recognize Israel as a state. And the Palestinian territories are declared as separate territories, but not a state. So they're not allowed to run themselves. The state of Israel runs them. A day later, May 15th, 1948, you see the League of Arab States promising to intervene to restore peace because there's massive conflict with this. The plan had not been working for the year. It's not like all of a sudden Britain left and the problems started. The problems were there the whole time, and no one wanted to address the fact Britain wanted to leave. And there was just a lot of conflict that went with it. So the League of Arab States, which are surrounding Arab populations, say that they're not going to allow fellow Arabs to be punished within the state of Israel. So you see armies from Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria all being deployed, which will effectively start the Arab-Israeli War. Within a few months, so the end of the year, December 1948, the West Bank was controlled by Jordan. The Gaza Strip was controlled by Egypt. So remember, those are those two separate Palestinian territories. And you see massive groups of both Arab refugees and Jewish refugees, because if you were living in not the wrong place, but like your homeland wasn't where the border was, when the state of Israel declared, you had massive issues on either side. So if you were living in Israel, the leaders of the Palestinian territory said you should, for your safety, you should leave. You should come to like the West Bank or to Gaza, whichever is closer. And when everything is settled, you can go back to your homeland. And it's very clear that that's not happening. And basically, those people become refugees because they're fleeing what will become violence. And then you have Jewish refugees on the other side, those that were living in areas like the West Bank and Gaza, who are told the same thing. They should flee to the internal state of Israel. Those that would, and then there are those that are stuck. And again, this is for either side. And their families are essentially on the other side of the fence, and they can't get to them. And you see massive conflict, not just from the militaries on either side, but now you have the civilians who are suffering from it. So this conflict, this fight, this arguing back and forth between Israel and Palestine on who owns what land and who should be in charge will continue for 20 years, essentially, until you have the 6-Day War. And that's going to happen in 1967. So basically what happens is in May 1967, Egypt and Jordan are going to sign a mutual defense pact. So remember, Jordan controls the West Bank, Egypt controls the Gaza Strip, and they set up mutual defense, which if you remember learning about World War I in world history, it's when you promise that if one side gets attacked, you'll jump in, and we all know how that turned out with World War I, but they're going to try it again. So with them agreeing that, the Israelis decide to rally together and strike first. So on June 5th, 1967, you will see Israel simultaneously attack Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in a coordinated effort. And they will occupy the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights and within 6 days. So June 5th to June 10th, 1967. And you will see them occupying. So occupying is when your military is coming in and enforcing control over that territory, regardless of whether or not you're supposed to be controlling that territory. Okay? That's going to last for quite a while, probably because it was an internal war. It wasn't necessarily affecting other countries like the UN, which had started many of these problems. So that's going to continue until 1973, when Syria and Egypt decide to band together, and they're going to attack on Yom Kippur, which, if you know anything about war history, normally you will see people cease fighting during what are considered very holy days. So it was a very big surprise, and they're very successful. They had already worked out a plan with OPEC. So OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So this is an organization that's just an economic organization. It's about making money off of oil. And they agree that all of their countries, which are the major oil producers in the world, they're going to place embargoes to prevent foreign support for Israel. So basically, you'll see that fighting. I don't know if any of you have parents who lived during that time, or grandparents that remember the oil shortages in the 70s. And it was a method to make the Western world realize how much they relied on that oil, and if they didn't follow the orders and basically refuse to support Israel, then it was going to be followed through. And that doesn't work out as well as they would hope, because it really just makes the West get involved again. So we're going to look at the modern concepts in two different veins, because there's still conflict today, and there's always been conflict, but there's still movements towards peace today, and there's always been movements towards peace. So let's do that in two separate movements. So let's talk about the movement towards peace. So the 1970s, again, you have that attack, and you have the excuse me, the U.S. And the UN getting involved. So in the 1970s, you'll see the Camp David Accords. And basically, you have the leaders of Egypt and Israel coming to the United States to Camp David and working it out, essentially, and coming up with a peace agreement. Okay? And this is considered one of the first steps in moving towards peace. It will be another 20 years or so before you get the next major movement in peace, which will be the 1993 Oslo Accords. Again, leaders working in a neutral area, in this case, Oslo. And in this case, you have the leaders of Israel and Palestine. And what they do is interesting, very diplomatic. You will see the leaders of both Israel and Palestine recognizing the existence of each other. That sounds weird, because obviously they existed, but you actually need other people to qualify your statehood in order for that to accept. If the American colonies had said, we're our own colonies now, or we're our own country now, and England refused to accept that, but also the rest of Europe refused to accept it, it wouldn't have been accepted, and we wouldn't have been considered a real country. In general terms, that would be like you walking into your sibling's room and saying, "This is my room now." And they're going to say no. And your parents say, no. No. And it doesn't matter how loud you yell that it's your room. It's not your room. However, if you walked into your sibling's room and you said, "This is my room now," and they said, "No, it's not," and then you ask your parents, and they're like, "No, that sounds like a good idea. It's your room now." Because the higher authority is accepting it, it becomes your room. I know it sounds weird, like it's not really applicable, but China would be your big example of this. When they had their Chinese Communist Revolution, the leading government that existed there fled to Taiwan. So between 1949 and 1972, when you talked about China, you were actually talking about Taiwan, because the rest of the UN and the European Union refused, along with the US, to acknowledge that the People's Republic of China was the real China. So it does happen in real global life. So shortly after the Oslo Accords, so you have a recognition between Israel and Palestine. Within the year, you'll have the Jordan-Israel peace agreement, which, remember, Jordan was controlling the West Bank, so by Israel recognizing Palestine as its own autonomous territory, you see Jordan willing to go towards peace. And it'll continue on. In 2000, you have the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Lebanon. So that, again, that was more of their occupied territory. In 2003, which is going to be a big event, you see the disengagement from the Gaza Strip, which again is removing soldiers from that occupied territory. There's also going to be a period where, I didn't put it on the slide, but they basically want to finalize the barriers of the West Bank. And it's going to be awkward because they're going to break it into like 3 sections, like section A, B, and C, essentially. In terms of where Israelis live and where Palestinians live, and who belongs to what. And then they're actually going to build a fence, which it's just never a good idea. Because when they build the fence, they actually build it too far into the West Bank, so part of the territory of the West Bank is actually still in Israel, which is why many people would argue that the West Bank is still occupied by Israel, because they do have forces there. And it's not like a little, it's something like 10 or 12% of the West Bank territory is on the other side of the fence. So it is a big chunk. Okay. So, but again, that was supposed to be a movement towards peace, and you see how that can go. All right, so let's talk about the conflicts. So you see this movement towards peace, but again, a lot of those movements were about diplomatic agreements. They weren't about the civilians and where they lived and what military was in charge of their lives. So you're going to have, excuse me, conflict in both Gaza and the West Bank. Between 2000 and 2006, you'll have intermittent violence and massacres. Like, it's periods of like, okay, things are good, and periods of everyone's dying. And it'll come from both sides. At some points, Israelis are attacking. At other points, Arabs are attacking. And again, it's really not just limited to the conflict between militaries. You do have a lot of civilian loss. Then, 2008 to 2009, you have the Gaza War, and you'll have movement again of Israeli forces into the Gaza territory. Okay. Then in 2012, you have the Operation Pillar of Defense, which was Israeli forces going into the Gaza area, and wasn't exceptionally long. I think it was like 10 days, 8 days, but enough of a conflict to gain full notice by the rest of the world. Again, your parents might remember a period when that was happened. It will be revisited again in 2 years with Operation Protective Edge. These are all different names. If you Google them, you'll probably find a bunch of different names for them. I just picked 2, but they're going to be the same conflicts. So again, more conflict in the Gaza Strip. And then most recently, you have the Israeli involvement in the Syrian Civil War, which we'll talk about that. Next week, we'll learn about the Syrian Civil War. Because remember, Syria was involved in a lot of the early conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis. So you have lots of movements towards peace. And you have a lot of conflict. It looks like we might be leaning again towards peace, particularly with a lot of argument around Jerusalem. So next class, you're going to learn more about Jerusalem and the important part it's playing in this conflict and what has happened very recently, just within the past couple of years, in determining how this conflict may finally be resolved, but unlikely. Again, until Palestine is recognized as a state that's separate from Israel, it's just inherent to have that conflict. So today, it's a very simple assignment. I basically just gave you a whole timeline, and what I want you to do is pick 4 of those events that you think were important, and you're going to tell me when it happened and what happened and why you think it's important. Obviously, everything is available for Google, so if I didn't explain it enough for you, or you're just interested and want to know more, type it in, find out some more, and you can include it in your write-up. All right, that's it for today. See you next class.